Have you ever heard that? Did that ever come up in your experience or research? The modern trend of multitasking, where it's all over in business, certainly in other things, can cause people to lose brain. Sorry.
Yeah, you're asking an important question, and I think it speaks to the whole issue of mind-body medicine. And we live in such a stressful society in every which way. You know, we all have our smartphones now, and you know, we need to know what's going on in the news. Rahman al-Islam, and it's been pretty bad. But we're constantly bombarded. Or every time I hear a little bing, it means I got a text message. Oh, someone's texting me. I'm so important, and you know, you text them back and see if they're going to text me back. And in a lovely Torah piece I was just learning this weekend, I was giving a shiur somewhere based on that sefer that, as you know, we've learned a little bit together. I'm so in love with the Bilvavi series, and one of his Svarim is called Dat Menuchatecha. No, there's a Bilvavi series. There's also a Da'et series, and one of the Da'et series is Da'et Menuchatecha. Know your Menuchas Nefesh, your equanimity. And he was in his sefer saying that even the fact that you know that you have your phone there, and it could ring, or there could be a text, or there could be, takes away from your equanimity, from your Menuchat HaNefesh. And if you feel that you have to answer that, you've given away your personal power to this thing. So we're living in such a high stress society that we all feel like we're multitasking always. And from a mind-body perspective, stress leads to elevated cholesterol levels from what's called the HP axis. The hypothalamus gets activated, then the pituitary gets activated. That activates the adrenal glands, and we're pumping out cortisol. And cortisol is excellent when it comes to emergent situations. There's some sort of crisis, God forbid, if we feel like we're endangered in some way, we want things to be pumping. This cortisol gives us that kind of fight or flight to cope. So there's a heavy evolutionary purpose to that. But I guess the caveman, after he ran away from the dinosaur, would go into the cave for the rest of the day and just kind of, enjoy and go online. I just need to do that. But now we have this constant stress, elevated cortisol. And cortisol is, when long-standing, is poisonous to the brain, actually, and causes that term I used before, apoptosis, cell damage, neuronal loss, especially in areas like the hippocampus, once again, that area of memory. So briefly, being in stress to cope is a good thing. But multitasking and running the whole day and having your cortisol always sky high does damage to the brain. So that's the mind-body pathophysiologic process that creates just what you said, Stuart.
This is interesting that you can rejuvenate or create new brain cells while you're losing them when you get older. Are we ever going to win that war? Are we going to lose 3 and gain back 1, so that we're always going lower anyhow? Is the amount of regeneration sufficient to really be optimistic that you're not going to lose as a net?
I'm very optimistic personally. Another one of the most exciting concepts for me that's emerged in these last 10, 20 years has been true. We all have our genetics. And there's those who in the past would say, oh, it's genetic, whatever it is, genetic. However, The newest term is epigenetic, meaning irrespective of what your genetics might be, and that there might be a certain vulnerability or diathesis, that it could be overridden with environmental approaches, like exercise, nutrition, reducing stress by various techniques. I think the best metaphor I once heard, I just loved it, and Amir Tzashem, it should apply to us, that there's two types of light bulbs. You have to with the physics. There's incandescent and fluorescent, and one type of light bulb, the way its demise is, it kind of gets more and more brown and weaker, and eventually just kind of peters out slowly and in a protracted way. The other type of light bulb, I don't remember which was which, maybe it's incandescent, that rather than that kind of demise, it's perfectly fine, and then when it's time to expire, just poof. So halavai, and with God's help, that should be all of us in the room, that rather than aging being a process where it's just, downhill, I got a couple brain cells back, but I just lost 20 today, and then eventually, everything just peters out. Halavai, that it should be that we maintain that wellness until the end, and that when it's time to be time, like that. One person who's written a lot on that, I think the book is called Aging Well, George Valiant is his name. He did like this Harvard study following people for like decades, and how they aged. Another interesting book was called The Blue Zone. I can't remember the author, where he looked at certain places in the world where they have all these epidemics of centenarians, and he asked the question, what is it about that one area in Costa Rica, for example? Okinawa was another area. Sardinia was another area. There was like about a dozen regions in the world. One area in California, interestingly, Loma Linda, California, was one of those blue zones. And he asked the question, he went there and tried to understand in each of those regions, what was it that had all these centenarians? It wasn't always the same. This area might have been more the diet. One area was very heavily faith-based and community-based. But it's empowering to know that we don't just have to kind of, age and, whatever. It's just the way it is. That there's so much that we can do to promote wellness, brain wellness, and vitality throughout our lives.
Ed Butner?
Yeah.
Google.
I know. Oh, but I'm so stressful just Googling it. I just felt so stressful from that. Just kidding. Was that, I'm not sure if that's considered multitasking there. Hi, Marcia.
Hi. Is this true? A psychologist once said this to me. He said that your whole life is spent trying to correct the things that went wrong in your childhood. Is that true?
Well, those early years are profound ones. It's true. But and they do impact very heavily. But I don't think I'd limit it to that. Our lives are always unfolding in so many ways, and just to reduce it to that, I think would be extreme. But I would say that I mentioned the hippocampus. That's the area of the brain involved with memory and how important that is. But actually, most people don't know this, but there's actually two areas of the brain involved in memory. And not that I'm putting anyone on the spot, although I'm looking to my right, but I ask my students this, they're sharp, they're still in medical school, they're residents, all right, what's the other area of the brain involved in memory? Hippocampus, and what's the other area? And very few people know this one. And the answer is the amygdala, which is that, again, that fight or flight area in the limbic system, in the brain, more posterior. And the difference is that in the hippocampus, it's a kind of memory that only starts at around age 3 because of the myelination there. So we remember, if you remember what you had for breakfast, that's your hippocampus. But certain things that you may not remember the details, but you remember how it made you feel. That usually is because of its activation of the amygdala memory. So in the first 2 or 3 years of life, there's really minimal hippocampal memory. But kids nonetheless remember everything. And early trauma, God forbid, stays with these kids, except they don't even remember it consciously through their hippocampus, but in some sort of emotional way through the amygdala activation. It's there. I had a patient recently, it was very sad, who was raised in an orphanage, and there was a lot of abuse until, I think, age 3. And doesn't remember anything, but still is left with a lot of emotional, severe sequelae. And I think that's the amygdala. So early childhood heavily impacts, especially that region. But to reduce all of our lives just to undoing that which our mother or father did to mess us up when we were little, maybe a bit too much. But I think the take-home messages with your kids is just love them and love them and love them. And I remember people saying, oh, with infants, you shouldn't spoil them, let them cry and don't spoil them. And my feeling was always, when they're that little, you just love them to pieces, and you just love them to pieces, because that's priming their amygdala to learn the world is safe, my parents love me, the world's a good place. And you want them in that early phase to have that resonate in their brain.
So if something has like a strong emotional component, let's say someone has a trauma when they're 10, they would have the hippocampal memory, and they would also have the memory, in the amygdala?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can have both at the same time?
Yes.
Okay.
And a lot of the work in PTSD.
Yeah.
You know what? Karen's around. Karen, I'm going to give it to you.
Let me speak now, Karen.
Okay.
A lot of the work with regards to PTSD then, and a lot of the cutting edge work, does have to do with taming the amygdala, so that that veteran, when they hear 4th of July fireworks, freaks out.
Yeah.
Their rational brain knows, oh, it's 4th of July, and they would be able to articulate to you, oh, rationally I'm aware that, this is safe and it's just, fireworks. And yet that other part of their brain will nonetheless maybe just lose it vis-a-vis the PTSD. And those techniques that are in the more cutting-edge, evidence-based psychotherapies work on how do you tame those brain centers, the areas like the amygdala.
What is the difference between psychotherapy and other therapy? When you go to a therapist, when you go to a psychologist.
Or just synonymous, I think.
It is synonymous.
Yeah, some people it's a longer word, psychotherapy, and they just say therapy. I think it's meant synonymously, really.
What is the subconscious meaning? Is it a separate entity? What is its role? How can we be more aware of it if in fact it's something that is not always overt?
Well, I don't know about your amygdala, but mine just shot right up.
I'll just repeat it. What is the subconscious? If it's a separate entity, what is its role? How can we be more aware of it? And if it's less perceivable, what can we do to be more aware of the subconscious?
Okay. have to swim around and then we'll.
This is strong enough.
I'll make it.
Well, you know, some of the terms like, you know, subconscious versus conscious, or what Freud would use terms like ego and id, I think now we're better able to understand the workings of the brain and really talk about it in terms of brain regions and brain physiology rather than, you know, abstract concepts like ego or id. Especially because we could see all these things, we could watch the brain at work these days with not just CAT scans or MRIs that take a snapshot, but things like PET scans or fMRIs that watch the brain at work, which is amazing. I think really then the subconscious does speak to more primitive brain areas. Our brain kind of evolved, and there's very little that looks different between the human brain and a dog's brain. It's almost frighteningly the same, except for our huge prefrontal cortices. Otherwise, those more downstream centers are quite the same. And I do believe that terms like subconscious is really speaking to those more downstream brain centers in areas like the limbic system, including the amygdala. And when we try to be more conscious, usually we're trying to activate our prefrontal cortices, the very, very frontal part of our brains, especially the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the OFC, the orbital frontal cortex, to have more wisdom in what we do. I can elaborate if you want to know an approach to how does one become more consciously aware and mindful as to leading one's life. I think that's what you're then asking is the second part of your question. Well, you know, I happen to be very big on mindfulness practice and really discerning moment by moment what's going on. I also have a strong interest in the practice of Musar. And really, that's what that's asking, moment by moment. You know, what's going on now? Which midah is coming up right now? What's going on right now? And I think the most important thing, and here, maybe you'll find this lovely quote for me, Stuart, while I'm talking, you'll read it to us. It's one of my favorites. It's by Viktor Frankl. And it starts off between stimulus and response. I'll talk a little bit more, you'll find it, because it answers Yehuda's question, the profundity of Viktor Frankl. But the more that we can make what he said, Frankl, and we'll hear the exact quote. We got, wow.
Cost you a few brains?
Yeah, I know.
Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom.
So amazing coming from a man who came up with all these thoughts and theories in Auschwitz. But I think what he was saying, Dr. Frankl, of the Shalom, was that too often we're very reactive. Someone says something and we just snap back, and that reactivity usually leads to less skilled responses when we fire back a response. If we could just get out of reacting and instead into responding, it makes all the difference. And it's the difference of about less than a second. Because from a brain-based perspective, if someone says something and you're upset, the amygdala fires, and then before you know it, you blurt out something, and then you live to regret it. Maybe that's happened to you. It's never happened to me, where someone said something and you just kind of and because it takes a little longer for those impulses to go from the limbic system to be routed up to the prefrontal cortices to say, hey, I could either lose it right now, but then, is that what I really want to do? And just that mindful pause can yield a lot of wisdom. And instead of becoming reactive, you could become responsive. And I think that Dr. Frankl was then arguing that if we could make a little daylight from that reactivity, we could really evolve and change as a human being. And in so doing lies our freedom or our liberation, which is pretty astounding that we're never static, as I said before. And it's a very freeing concept to think that even if I've done something the same way 10,000 times, at this moment, I could still make that choice to tap into wise relationship in that moment. And irrespective if I do the exact same thing 10,000 times, this time, I don't have to go there. And how liberating that could be. How remarkable it is that a man is contemplating liberation and felt liberated, composing his theories in his book in Auschwitz. Most people know the book Man's Search for Meaning. What most people don't know is that wasn't the original title of the book. Anyone know the original title of the book? That's a really tough Jeopardy category question. Anyone know that?
Logotherapy.
No. That's what he called it. But Man's Search for Meaning was initially not the title of the book. And Stuart could Google that just to let us know if I'm right or wrong. But if I'm not mistaken, the original title was From Death Camp to Existentialism. But they thought that wouldn't sell.
There goes Wikipedia.
Okay, but From Death Camp to Existentialism. But remarkable that a man could be feeling and talking about liberation because he was free to choose how to respond even to the bestiality of those oppressors, even where he was. So we're never locked in and static.
Just to understand it, drop more. When the brain is formulating a response, and when you say, not that you've said it, sorry, when the brain is formulating a response, and when it's said that by pausing longer, a better response, a healthy response can be forthcoming, I just would like to understand in layman's terms, what is the brain tapping into to get the information provided a better response, and can we by mistake tap into the wrong thing? Is it a matter of just time, giving it enough time to tap into the correct place to get a healthy response? Or do we have to do other things to make sure we don't allow the brain to channel into another area which is more going to give us an unhealthy response? Am I clear?
Yeah, well, I think the added time gives us a chance to reroute things from that reactive part of our brain in the limbic system, in areas like the amygdala, to the prefrontal cortex, where wisdom emerges. It takes a little longer than that short road of the amygdala activation to give it another 0.7 seconds roughly to route it to the prefrontal cortices, which are usually then able to talk to the other areas of the brain and to say, I could really lose it right now, but do I really want to do that, or will I be shooting myself in the foot?
Based on whatever knowledge base the person has.
Yes.
If they have the wrong knowledge base, they'll react inappropriately.
Well, therefore it's good to study and contemplate and reflect. One of the greatest tools I feel for self-growth, personality-wise, Torah-wise, that I would encourage people to think about from tonight is a journal. Because that's sort of equivalent to the prefrontal cortices, taking yourself out of yourself. It's sort of a meta-cognition or a meta-awareness. And for me, I find it invaluable. Because I rationalize everything, don't we all? Well, of course because, we just rationalize, and maybe we feel bad about what we did, but in 2 seconds, whatever. So then it could be very excruciating to have paper and pen.
Contemplate.
Yeah, and journal, those things that I want to work on, or those, and that's feeding the prefrontal cortex, like, you know, for the next time.
What kind of paper should we use, Jessica?
Just don't leave it lying on the shulchan here. Oh my God, Yehuda's working on anger. My God, I didn't know that.
Before you call someone this time, I move over there.
Sorry?
Before you call the next person, let me know something over there.
So from a Musar perspective, that which is a big piece of my avoda, the journaling is huge. And I would reference you to the Sefer by Rav Menachem Mendel Leffen, written I think in 1812, Cheshbon HaNefesh.
Leffen?
Yeah.
L-E, okay.
Yeah.
We'll find
In
it.
Hebrew it's Cheshbon HaNefesh. I think around 1812.
I'm going to ask some very tachlis questions. Maybe you can help with it. We all have situations, including me, knowing a lot more about where to get resources. A lot of people need to know if you run into a situation, both in a close relative, like a spouse or a sibling or a child, or in somebody you are familiar with and friendly with, or even with a stranger, who you think needs help. What are the resources in our community that you should extend to attempt to get this help? And tough question. I personally have had experience with patients who call people I refer them to and say they don't take my insurance, they don't have time, I can't see them for 6 months. And it's a real problem. Maybe you can help some of the people here with that problem.
Well, you're right, and that's probably the toughest question for tonight. It's easier if finances are not an issue. And there's a couple of resources I use, because there's a lot of wonderful doctors out there, but there's a lot of horrible doctors. And even somebody, if they're chairman of the department of surgery or whatever, often means nothing in terms of, can they operate? So there's a couple numbers I have. Refuah Resources, I think, is one, where this Rabbi Berman in Brooklyn, you call them up and you say, I have a friend with, asthma. And they'll say, here's 2 or 3 doctors that, are the best. The organization Nefesh is an excellent resource to contact them in terms of mental health related referrals.
There are 2 places that really go under the heading of Jewish organizations. One of them is the Sandfield Y, which has psychiatric resources, and the other one is the Pride of Judea. Can you just comment about that?
Well, I don't know very much about them, but I've heard nice things about the Pride of Judea, and it's reasonable rates for people who just can't afford certain exorbitant costs. I hear that it's a very lovely facility. I've heard a lot of nice things. And no matter where you go, make sure you know your own stuff. And I'm happy we had this venue, because whatever you're addressing, the more reading. I know some physicians get very defensive when their patients come in and say, "Doctor, I was online last night." And I know doctors have gotten very offended. And, you're judging me. You're trying, second guessing me, which is just ego. When I have that experience of patients coming and saying, after our conversation last time, I went online. I just wanted to run that by you. My response is always, "That's fantastic." The more information you have, the more empowered you are, the more well-being that could emerge. And maybe you read something online that I wasn't aware of. 30 years ago, we would have read the standard textbooks, and maybe there was very, very little that a patient would have access to or know that we did not, perhaps. But with the internet now, there's no way I could say that I know everything on the internet about the field. So if patients come to me and did a little digging and come up with a nice idea, I don't get defensive. I welcome and say, "Great, tell me what you got, and let's kick it around." But it's good that you're asking these things because costs are a big issue. And being comfortable with your doctor, be it in any field. We're talking about psychiatry tonight, or your psychotherapist. You know, is there that kind of working relationship that you feel comfortable with?
Wait, one second. Everybody here.
Okay.
Oh, good.
It works.
Yeah, it works.
Doctor? Okay. Should I hold the button down?
No, actually, you don't have to.
Okay. Are you Freudian?
What would make you say that?
No, I want to ask you something.
I'm not.
Oh, you're not? Okay.
Not at all.
Name, okay, this question is irrelevant then. Okay.
Well, you could ask anyway if you like, but...
Because, okay, a full man is a psychiatrist. Do you have a problem with Lashon Hara? People speaking to you about somebody, and are you speaking to them?
Well, I think I'm definitely not one thing I'm definitely not is a rabbi or a posek, but I often hear people vis-a-vis Lashon Hara use the concept of toelet, if there's a purpose. And I would believe that going to a psychotherapist, because there's some huge issues going on that they want to work through, is a toelet, and it's not just paying someone to tell them Lashon Hara. Enough people will listen for free. God forbid.
Let me just ask you one question. What's the difference between when does perfectionist become OCD?
I think for me a distinction could be when there's internal upset and dissatisfaction, unhappiness, dysfunction that ensues. Me, I like to be timely. I asked Mel at 7:30. Should we start? And he said, well, give it a little bit of time. I said, that's fine. But just for me, I just find that for me, my life is less frenetic, I'm less anxious. Again, that word equanimity. If I just feel that my time is orderly. And from a Musar perspective, Seder is maybe the most important midah of all. One Musar master equated it to a necklace with pearls. But the most important one is the clasp at the back. If not for the clasp on the back of the necklace, all the other jewels will just scatter away. And Seder is that. So for me, I find that enormously helpful. And don't see that as causing problem or dysfunction. But if someone's perfectionistic to the point that it's affecting their overall happiness, the nature of their relationships, their capacity to work, I think that's the area that would alert someone that this is a problem.
Classically, there was the image of the psychotherapist as the person who would sit and listen, nod his head, and listen, or her head, and the patient might not get much feedback in the end. It wasn't a back and forth.
Uh-huh.
I think
What do you mean by that?
Thanks for a little bit of
Sorry, couldn't resist.
breaking the mold. But is that, as opposed to being very interventional or being very much involved and maybe giving a lot of advice or being there must be a balance, because you can't do that either. You want the patient to arrive at his or her own solutions to some extent.
Maybe
I don't know
not.
what the answer
I
is.
think things have changed
Can you discuss
dramatically.
that a little bit?
Yeah, things have changed dramatically. And when I trained, it was initially, when I did my residency, it was heavily psychoanalytic, where I happened to be. And every one of my supervisors was from Columbia Psychoanalytic, and how we were advised how to perform psychotherapy. But those days are just about passé. there needs to be some wisdom to let people have space when they need to express or get in touch with emotion. But the extreme passive, just listening, those days are less and less that you hear that. And a CBT approach is often very tachlis, and let's look at the problem, let's look at some of the solutions, and it's really, the therapist getting right in there, and maybe even assigning homework assignments. Between now and next time, I want you to do da 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 da, and we see each other next time. I want to hear how that worked out, and you'll give me a report. So it's just much more proactive than this passive, analytic kind of posture. I think we're good.
I think we're done. That was great. That really was. I don't think there's anybody here